actually wanted to return to something that we were supposed to read a few weeks ago, but we didn't get to in class, and that is the poems by Paul Celan. So there are a couple of literary figures that Adorno references in aesthetic theory. One is Samuel Beckett, and the other is Paul Celan. So these are exemplars for him of post-World War II aesthetics, we might say. They're literary examples, although in the case of Beckett, he's a playwright as well as a novelist and a poet, whereas Paul Celan is a lyric poet. So we were meant to discuss this in the week of lyric poetry and its crisis as a kind of fourth example. After Goethe, Lorica, Jorga, and then Celan as a kind of a late example. Last week, for the few who attended during Critique Week, we discussed the foreign informal music, and there was a Beckett epigraph to that essay, to say it without knowing what. And the program, if you will, the kind of paradoxical positive program of foreign informal music by Adorno is the injunction to create something without knowing what it is. Much earlier in the course, I think that we looked at Baudelaire. Did we look at Baudelaire? No, we never looked at Baudelaire at all. We did?
We did.
Okay. All right. Where his dedications of his aphorisms or his prose poems to his editor or publisher is to say that he's not sure he created anything, and other people would delight in that, what he's created or anything at all, whether he's created anything at all, but that it was humiliating for him because his goal as an artist or as a literary writer is to produce exactly what he intends to produce, which is, of course, the old kind of craft notion of art. Okay. So in terms of the crisis of lyric poetry in the capitalist era, but especially in the what we might call the late capitalist era, the 20th century, Adorno is famous for writing in an essay called Cultural Criticism in Society that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. But then he followed that up by saying, while it might be barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, namely to create art of any kind, art and literature of any kind, music included, after Auschwitz is barbaric, still you can't deny people the right to express suffering. All right, so let's look at Paul Celan, who is himself literally a Holocaust survivor, and his family was killed in the Holocaust, and who was an important but also kind of controversial poet in the post-World War II world in German literature. These are selections from his later writings. He didn't live in Germany, he lived in France. He lived in Paris, and tragically, he killed himself. He drowned himself in the Seine River because he suffered from depression. But as a contemporary, he met Adorno, and he corresponded and also met. Song. No one needs us again from earth and loam. No one evokes our dust. No one. Praised be you, no one. Because of you, we wish to bloom against you. A nothing were we, are we, will we be, blossoming. The nothings, the no one's rose. With its pistil so bright, its stamen heaven praised, its crown red, from the purple word that we sang over, oh over its thorn. The unreadability of this world, all doubles. The strong clocks back the fissure hour hoarsely. You, wedged into your deepest, climb out of yourself forever. I hear the axe has blossomed. I hear the place is unnameable. I hear the bread, which looks at him, heals the hanged man. The bread the woman baked for him. I hear they call life the only shelter. Strangeness has netted us. Transience reaches helplessly through us. Take my pulse, it too, into yourself. Then we shall prevail against you, against me. Something enclothes us in day skin and night skin for the game with the highest epileptic seriousness. Thread suns above the gray-black wastes, a tree-high thought grasps the light tone. There are still songs to sing beyond mankind. Okay, so that last thought, songs to sing beyond mankind, meaning maybe art has taken its leave of humanity. This is a thought that Adorno entertains. If you recall, the Marxist definition of capitalism is the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. And Adorno called aesthetic form a force of production. A force of production. So bourgeois social relations, those are the social relations of labor. So it's tied to a humanistic view of the world. So humanity being the measure of all things, right? That would be the bourgeois conception, and a Renaissance humanistic conception. The idea of bourgeois society returning to our natural potential against a decadent civilization. That's how the bourgeois revolutionaries understood what they were doing. They're restoring our natural freedom against the barbarism of civilization. That was the view in the 17th and 18th century. European civilization had become barbaric. So what was needed was a revolution to restore natural rights, natural freedom, natural potential of humanity. But then we landed in capitalism. So again, Adorno calls aesthetic form a pure force of production, not just a force of production, but a pure force of production. And in capitalism, it seems that the forces of production take leave of humanity. They leave the human measure behind. The industrial forces of production outstrip human labor. They leave it behind. So that's a catastrophe for a society of labor, but it's also a potentiality of another principle of humanity beyond labor. So the industrial forces of production give us the possibility of a society beyond labor, of humanity beyond labor, but in capitalism it means the dehumanization of labor in the deleterious sense. Right, so art mimics that. We've talked about that in previous weeks. The idea, the mimetic character of art, the mimetic character of aesthetic form of art in capitalism is that art mimics less our humanity than our conditions of industrial production. So in the reading that we did last week, For an Informal Music, Adorno talks about electronic music, computer music, music based on mathematical principles. of mathematical principles divorced from human aesthetics. So classical tonality in music is based on natural harmonics that are nonetheless still tied to a human perception of sound and aesthetics of music. Then in the 20th century, we had the possibility of creating music that, or creating some kind of formalized sound constructions that are based on the possibilities of technology and not necessarily based at all on a human sensibility. So electronic music, computer music. Benjamin, who we've discussed previously as Adorno's friend and mentor, Benjamin said Adorno was his only student. He famously wrote in The Task of the Translator that no poem is meant for a reader, no piece of music for a listener, no painting for a viewer. Kind of paradoxical formulation. And this is his introduction to his translation of Baudelaire into German, previously done by Stefan Jorge. So what was meant was, the reason that the poem is not meant for the reader, or the painting not meant for the viewer, or the music not meant for the listener, is because it's meant to change the listener. It's meant to change the viewer. It's meant to change the reader. In other words, it isn't based on what reading or listening or viewing are, but what they could be, but are not yet. But it's become even more radical than that. In 20th century art, it seems like art is based on principles that are no longer about human aesthetic imagination or sensibility. So, paradox that we have with Adorno's aesthetic theory is that it's an aesthetic theory of art beyond aesthetics. Now, we're, perhaps not, I don't know how much you guys have encountered this, in postmodernism, the anti-aesthetic. The anti-aesthetic. The idea that the 20th century avant-garde as some kind of a model for postmodernism is not merely not aesthetic, but might indeed be anti-aesthetic. Might be working actively to counteract the aesthetic as the principle of art. Well, that's among writers who write after Adorno's time, starting in the 70s. Nonetheless, there's some anticipation of this already by Adorno in aesthetic theory. Mm-hmm.
So that means like anti-aesthetic is like aesthetic in terms of like of the senses, so art that's not of the senses, or like
even beyond that.
Like beauty.
Even beyond that. Yeah, even beyond that.
I don't get it.
Right, so it's not just concept art, which might not be about like aesthetics, feeling, but even beyond that, because it's beyond the sort of imagination of the work, right? So it challenges the very notion of the work itself, right? The coherence of the artwork itself. Or, again, in Adorno's terms, the autonomy of the artwork, which for Kant, where we started the course, is based on a sympathetic resonance with the autonomy, the freedom, the self-determination of the subject. So the autonomy of the object seeming to express the autonomy of the subject. Now, the autonomy of the object is divorced from the autonomy of the subject. And that's what was really meant by the anti-aesthetic. the idea that you could have a non-human or post-human notion of the artwork. So, again, 20th century avant-garde, early 20th century avant-garde, circa World War I and its aftermath. It seems like artists embraced practices and produced works that defied an aesthetic resolution in terms of a subject. So the artwork seemed to embody a different kind of subject, not a human subject. Not anything like a human subject.
Do you think that thing still holds in this contemporary period?
I don't know. I think that people are less radical now. I think that in the 60s and 70s, especially, maybe into the 80s, not so much though, that there was a kind of neo-avant-gardism that really tried to use some postmodernist language, deconstruct the subject, deconstruct the artwork as directed at the subject or as relating to the subject. I think people have backed off from that. I think things are a lot more conservative now.
I thought you disliked postmodernism.
I do dislike. However, we have to accept its historical reality, meaning it expressed something. It was some kind of a phenomenon. It was something. It had its moment. And so, again, in keeping with Adorno, so when we looked at those 20s, he said, well, look, I'm like maybe stuck in the past, and my notion of like artistic possibility is pre-World War I, which is paradoxical. It's even before his own time. But nonetheless, people are doing things, and so one needs to figure out why. Right? I mean, my beef with postmodernism has more to do with the discourse of it than with the practices of it, because I think the discourse of it was, to use a Marxist expression, more concealing than revealing, more obscuring than clarifying, I think. But we know this from the linguistic turn. You guys know this idea, the linguistic turn? So the idea that like language has its own structure and humans are sort of formed by language. So language has this kind of formal effect, and humans are always sort of imperfect users of language, that somehow language has its own sort of logic and structure, and humans are just sort of bearers of that without really being fully up to it. It's kind of structuralism, post-structuralism kind of moment of the mid-20th century. Again, I feel like it expresses something, but it also, maybe it's not language, maybe it's capitalism. Right, so that would be the kind of Marxist gambit, which is to say what people are attributing to culture or language or these kinds of forms might actually be a phenomenon of capitalism. It might be in our social relations rather than in any of these given forms. Certainly you guys have read some postmodernism. Logos, the agonize over logos. Logos is religion. Logos is religion. In the beginning was the word.
So it seems like Zizek seems like part of his project is precisely to do that, is to link language and capitalism as a kind of unified big other. Are you into that or no?
I don't think that capitalism is structured like a language. I also don't think language is. It's okay. So let's put it in Adorno's terms. So if Adorno says that aesthetic form is a pure force of production, then what we have is a situation where we've created tools that we perhaps have not mastered and that therefore seem to dominate us, but they still are our creation. Right? So if something inhuman has emerged, it's still the product of humanity. Which is different from like a Heideggerian idea that technology has a logic of its own. Right, it has kind of a logic that's expressive of the logic of being, and that we have to be kind of humble and circumspect and respectful about that power and not think that we can wield it, but to recognize that it always, in a sense, wields us.
Well, if that's not true, then why are we having a hard time mastering it?
For political reasons, for social reasons, in other words, for like mundane reasons, right? Not divine or natural reasons.
Going back to the anti-aesthetic, like, I can certainly appreciate the reasons for making it sort of emergence to postmodernism, sort of making it coincide with postmodernism, but like, I'm thinking of much earlier work, let's say like Dead Landrian, it seems pretty anti-aesthetic to me, like it's just pure formalism or whatever.
Is it? Is it anti-aesthetic?
So, I mean, at least in terms of motivations, I mean, one could argue that it ends up looking nice, but I think that I don't think his concerns were about beauty or anything of the sort. In fact, I don't think the subject was, it feels alienated to the subject. He's talking about pure spaces, pure lines, you know, pure geometries. There's not much humanism in that, in my opinion. Though I think
Pretty aesthetic.
I think the aesthetic is accidental from him, or like incidental. I don't know. I'm not sure how you feel about that.
It's tricky. I was looking for the jazz paintings. Is this one of the jazz paintings, kind of? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like
Yeah,
the late
that
looking.
is. That's like, yeah, that's the one supposed to be looking down at a busy street or whatever.
I mean, that's a human mark. It's paint strokes. It's brush strokes. It's a human mark. It gets a lot more radical than this later,
Yeah.
right?
I feel like this is one of the more generous selections, though, to be honest.
Well, it's
like
the first
you-
thing that I thought of. I thought, what's my
Yeah.
counterexample?
I'm thinking of his more like, I'm thinking of like red, yellow, blue, red, or just red, blue, yellow.
Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, I wrote shit. All children.
Obviously not early Mondrian either. But only applied to late
Right.
Mondrian.
So this one.
Yeah, I think that'd probably be the best example of something that doesn't seem to me to be driven by an aesthetic impulse so much as a theoretical one.
Mathematical.
Mathematical, geometric, spatial.
I guess I always saw these things where he's retreating to like pure geometry, or even like some like early goddess of, I forget the name of the artist who had all these pieces where he dropped pieces of paper and then traced them like where they fell.
Oh, that was Duchamp.
Oh, I thought that was like a non-Duchamp. No, maybe that was Duchamp.
Talking about the streams that
No,
that's
these
not-
rectangles of
Oh,
paper.
oh, yeah.
And then, but I guess.
Not
I was-
Malevich. Not Malevich.
I think actually maybe. But I don't know, with all these things where it seems to be like we're not letting our own artistic sensibility, like what looks nice, control what enters like the frame. I always saw that as knowing that we can't create all different types of aesthetic experience because we're bound up by conventions that are going to control what we're doing. So something like this, even though it feels completely removed from an aesthetic, is trying to create an aesthetic experience that we otherwise couldn't if we maintain control.
You mean if we adopt a kind of aleatory or arbitrary system?
Yeah.
This is something that Adorno talked about in foreign and formal music, right? So why artists would be drawn to formal systems and aleatory devices to produce things that they wouldn't themselves design, right?
Yeah.
And then see what the aesthetic effect was that resulted from the aleatory device.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like, the way you describe it is pretty like dialectical and very Adorno sort of way, I suppose. Like, it's like grasping for an anti-aesthetic that will thereby become an aesthetic.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, to my point,
Yeah, go ahead.
even if it undergoes that dialectical sort of sublation or whatever, like it starts off as an anti-aesthetic with intention. Or well, I guess the intention is the thing in question. Yeah, the intention is the thing in question. But yeah, I don't know. It's, yeah, interesting. I don't know. Jury's out.
I guess with the later postmodern stuff, do you think the experience is still the intention at the end of it, or do you think they actually went beyond desiring there to be an experience in that?
That's kind of where I'm a little bit stuck with some of this. Is like there's some examples that are maybe clearly fit into the category you're talking about, like concept art. You know, I forgot the guy's name. We're just like the chairs, 3 chairs or whatever.
Oh no.
Three
Did that
chairs.
one.
You know what I'm talking about, though. Like, so that probably is like a pretty safe example of like just pure anti-aesthetic. But even there, like the way they're arranged on the wall, right? It's like it's not random. They're not like the chair over there, the sign over here. They're like, you know, there's a snugness to it, right? And that's even more so with like less on the nose concept art, I would say. Or
It's like the limits of form.
yeah, a kind of like limit point where the concept and the form necessarily brush up against each other. It's how could they not, unless you just like, I guess although going back to what we were talking about the other day, the only way to escape it is if you just wrote out
Yeah.
like the plan for the work, but didn't produce it.
Didn't actually execute it.
Yeah, which some artists have done.
Although even just contemplating the concept has the aesthetic component, you're supposed to feel something, I assume.
Yeah.
Even like looking at the chair, even if you're ignoring what it visually looks like, there's still an experience of piecing together these different things and making the sort of connections in your mind through the work for the concept of the thing. And I'm not sure if they're seeing that as an artistic experience or as something completely outside of it.
Well, like also like which chair is chosen, right? Of all the chairs that exist, they have this select one, and then like what color is the canvas with the word chair going to be? Like black, white, blue, you know, like all these are all aesthetic choices ultimately.
So Michael Fried in his piece Art and Objecthood complained about the specific objects of the minimalist sculptors, like the Donald Judd kind of move. He called it literalism. And also, the complaint was that the work seemed to assert an independent existence from the viewer, so it didn't invite the viewer into an experience, but kind of bullied the viewer. So this title is kind of insane. But Peter Slodal, he's like the New Yorker kind of whatever dude. The cold, imperious beauty of Donald Judd, right? Beauty, right, but cold and imperious. Okay. What about the pathos of it? Is there a pathos?
The cold one. I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, like, even the most like rigid, hair up your ass, like fascist architecture or art has a pathos, a bad one, but I don't know. Like, if I walked past that, I wouldn't immediately think to myself, like, I feel nothing. I would be like, that's kind of cool. That was nice. You know?
These are objects that can only be produced by industrial technique. So that's also part of it. Yeah, so we're kind of submitting to the poetry of the machine. I mean, Mondrian is a little bit different, right? Like, it's not quite that. It's still playful.
Yeah. There's no cynicism in it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with Judd is that maybe it's cynical, maybe it isn't, you know? Like, so I mentioned Michael Fried's criticism. Well, Michael Fried might be wrong, or he might just be conservative in the face of this, perhaps, you know? So Adorno's trying not to be. Adorno's trying not to have a conservative reaction. He's not trying to insist upon a sensibility, you know, but trying to be open to, again, what would the human motivation for the inhuman be? Right, because these things are still created by people. And yet do defy a kind of reassimilation back into humanism.
I mean, it seems to be like with the Adorno's thing of the art being the truth value, society making inhuman art that looks cold and completely alien to us is some sort of cry for help or recognition of the state that we're in. Even if, I don't know if you go so far to say that, like, even if they're expressly not doing that, like subconsciously, that's just what it always becomes. Or there's like the more self-conscious stuff like Warhol, where he's making self-consciously like non-artistic, corporate-ish product things. But
He
I mean,
paints the
that's-
Brillo boxes, though.
Yeah.
He paints them.
He tries to shield himself with irony, though, is I think the kind of, and maybe in this case too, right? Like,
Maybe. Maybe. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It seems like Judd was more philosophically kind of motivated,
yeah,
right? Less ironical.
yeah, I think there's a,
Well, then Baudrillard on Warhol argued that's why Warhol was better than all the other ones, because he wasn't trying to inhabit, like pretend that there's still this thing as like philosophical art or whatever, and that he let himself be just as like stupid as the society around him, which I don't know how I feel about that, but his lack of thought made the work a more genuine reflection of what he was trying to accomplish than if you were trying to create the same thing as some philosophical justification.
So last week we, because of Richard Strauss being in the mix of like kind of a high modernism and then into late modernism, I played the 2001 Space Odyssey, you know, the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you know, the monolith, right? Is the monolith a Donald Judd sculpture? Yes.
it is?
Of course it is. Absolutely. Totally.
Wait, what do you mean in the, what do you, sorry.
The monolith in the film.
If
You guys
he was
know.
commissioned to produce that?
No.
Oh,
No.
okay.
All I'm saying is clearly, though, right? You know,
Figuratively,
yeah, figuratively, the primates are supposed to like lose their minds, you know, in the face of the pure form. You know.
Yeah, that's I was including the Scandal building. Like it's the picture for it.
The proportions, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and interestingly, that this insight we're on now is in the film, but not the book. The book, which is much weaker than the film, Marcus and Clark, the monolith is actually like this complex machine that's like inducing telepathy in them and all this stuff. Whereas in the film, it's a shock.
It's just a thing.
Shock of formalism,
Yeah.
shock of technology or whatever.
Right. Right. That's right.
I mean, wouldn't part of Judd's work for Adorno be like its uselessness and that it's using industrial production
For its own sake.
to produce useless objects? So that
Sure.
isn't that like
Sure.
country also doing?
Well, it's the force of production for its own sake.
Which is like a recuperation of not being human or whatever.
Meaning, okay, so here's like the Marxist view. Perhaps the problem with capitalism is that it ties humans to technology, but it also ties technology to humans. So maybe the point of getting beyond capitalism is to free technology from the humans as well as free humans from the technology. Right, so the nexus that we occupy with technology and capitalism can be broken, and possibilities for both the human and for technology can be unleashed.
Well, that's O.G. Marx, and Adorno's responding to the failure of that already.
Right. Right. And yet, art seems to still circle about it. But even when not so literal as like industrially produced objects, still the idea of the aesthetic form as a pure force of production that creates things that are no longer bound by criteria of human sensibility or aesthetic imagination.
I mean, we're also leaving out like productivism and constructivism.
Right, and we could certainly include those. That's right. So,
And almost a more direct.
yep.
That's like the taking back, so to speak, or disalienating, to make up a word here.
Or unleashing a kind of machine aesthetic.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. Right, but that's early 20th century. This is late 20th century. Or late-ish 20th century, like not super late 20th century, but 60s. So it's kind of late 20th century. You know, it's the late 20th century that is only now expiring. If it's expiring. But it's only now expiring. It's the late 20th century that's pretty much loomed over us until now.
Has anyone ever taken like whatever industrial machine it would take to like make one of these and just put that on display? I don't know. I'm trying to think if that would
I'm sure.
advance anything
I kind of feel like no doubt.
meaningfully. I can't think of an example.
Neither can I, but
But that it's still like you have the industrial with this, you still have the industrial like machine creating the thing, but it's still being created to do something that a human decided to make it do. Where I guess whatever aesthetic form of the machine itself, everything there was constructed specifically with this technical purpose. So that seems like the full realization of.
Well, what was this? Like Bauhaus had like this, which, not like we actually, like, I forgot what I don't have the citation in my brain right now, but I feel like some of the Bauhaus artists were doing things like that, where like the space that they designed to work in,
Yeah.
like was the whole thing, you know, like whatever comes out is sort of incidental.
Yeah.
it's like constructivism because it's sort of 20s, it's sort of teens and 20s.
Yeah.
The category from Adorno that I want to invoke now is artifact. So artwork and artifact, the relation between artwork and artifact. Namely that this has an artifactual quality, like the same way as the monolith in 2001, meaning it's like an artifact, but of what? And, like what was its original purpose? Did it have an original purpose, or, is it asserting an autonomy that it didn't already have to begin with? So the surrealist found object, right? So the object that did have a use value, that did have an exchange value, but then seems to take on a second life for its own sake, where it's divorced from its original use or exchange value. So it's a sort of commodity freed from commodity relations. Right, the artifactual character of art, and why I think that I mentioned that, and I'm always forgetting who it is, whether it's Rothko or not, it being inspired by Machu Picchu, right, which is this ritual site from the ancient Incas that had been abandoned, and so no one actually knows what the rituals actually were. And so you just get a kind of ritual form divorced from the ritual, and seems to sort of exist for its own sake now. And it's become an artwork, right? But it's not an artwork; it's an artifact.
Have you heard of those dodecahedrons they find all over Europe, but they have no idea what purpose?
Yes. Yeah, that's from the Druids. No, it's from the sort of, who knows? Yeah, it's from the ancient.
And so, like, who's the third, right? Not the 60, not which. So bad in our history. The one
Not
where
all-
like, had like stuff stretched across in corners.
I thought Malevich did that
No,
too.
no. It was the
The
guy.
corner
it was
works.
really his rival. They didn't want to be in the same room at the
All right.
1917 big exhibition, or the last Futures exhibition or whatever.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But anyway, whatever his name is, we'll find in a moment. His pieces, I feel like he was.
It's not Malevich though. So who is it?
No, it's.
All right, I'm gonna put in Lisitsky and Malevich.
It was Malevich's like arch rival. They in the last Futures exhibit, they had to be in separate rooms because they hated each other. But anyway, the reason I bring him up is because his work, I feel, is like it would appear artifactual, but it's not, because they're not things that were ever like actually used. They're just like produced and then incorporated straight into his work.
Well, what were they called?
They were Tatlin.
It's Tatlin?
Tatlin,
Okay, it's
yeah.
Tatlin, okay. He did the corner pieces?
Yeah.
All right, okay.
And in particular, the one.
Oh, yeah.
that
Yeah,
one,
you're
that's what
right.
I was thinking of. So like that's just a case where it's like it would almost appear artifactual at first glance, but I think he's trying to like sort of get in front of its existence as an artifact. Like it can't be an artifact because it was never like actually used in any industrial process. It's just off the assembly line into the studio, and then he's using the objects kind of like to allow them to speak on their own terms and kind of like anti-aesthetic that embraces the machine quality of them, but they're also not artifacts. So I just thought it was an interesting case somewhere in between these things.
Well, they do seem to be aesthetic.
Yes, he makes them aesthetic, sure, but they're objects that were not built for that, right? Like
They're architectural adornments. They are. It's not Adolf Loos' rejection of ornamentation. Might be like a severe ornamentation, but it still has a kind of ornamentation.
yeah.
Like it has a kind of formal whim, freedom, whimsy. Yeah. I mean, this text is horrible though because it's like, oh, it's Russian Orthodox corner icons, right? Because Malevich, I think, sometimes installed his works in corners like that
Well,
too.
the black square in the same show was put up in the corner, and that was a very definite reference to the icons. This, I think, not so much. Or I don't know.
Maybe, right?
Yeah,
Possibly.
It has, yeah, it'd be hard to divorce it from that.
But again, that's reducing it back to culture. Right?
This one reminds me, and I guess the idea of getting ahead of it being artifact by never having this like purpose to begin with.
Mhm.
There was the Cody Satterwhite show last year at the SAC Galleries. He had these. It was these like there was it was like multiple parts, but there was these sketches that his mom, who had schizophrenia, would make of all these like diagrams of these inventions, right? But then on like blueprint paper, and these like super like scribbly sketches, and then he made sculptures of these little like machines and inventions that treated, but he didn't make them the sculpture, like the actual realization of the piece. He used like clay to imitate the actual strings. So he made the actual machine, the blueprint itself, but as this like 3D thing, and the machine itself was like the sketch taking on its own purpose, not as this representation of a thing that could be something else, but its own in of itself purposiveness of all of these jagged lines and like the actual empty space in between the sort of impressions of like these like machine parts, which seems to be getting at something differently, but I don't know. I don't know where that gets us in terms of aesthetic, anti-aesthetic. I mean, they're very weird to look at, and it's kind of like heady and like sort of trippy to be like, ooh, like why would someone make this like, you're not supposed to make a blueprint into just a blueprint as itself. But I don't know if that gets us anywhere.
Have you guys heard of Arakawa? Maybe some of you. Not the manga artist. What do you call him? Is he an illustrator? What is he? Yeah.
I'm also just thinking of like Goldberg machines.
Yeah.
You know, like this sort of like
Yeah,
Goldberg
works.
machine. It's like the industrial process taken to
Oh my goodness, they
Yeah.
have nothing.
So like not even neutralized, but taken over to the other side. You know, all the way to like ridiculousness.
Yes.
You got too many manga. You got a manga person. I don't know if these are great examples or not. They're okay examples. These are not the best examples. Okay, this is not what I was thinking. He does text, but he also does sort of. It reminded me, Zani, of what you were saying about the sort of blueprint kind of, or illustration, but sort of for its own sake.
I guess the interesting gesture there is that it's like it's not a blueprint.
Yeah.
It appears as one, but it's like
But it is
taking
the-
away its authority as,
Yeah.
as like this sort of thing of something else. Like no, the buck stops here. Actually.
Yeah, and the sort of connection of schizophrenia in that made me think that it's probably coming from like a Deleuze angle of it being like the body without organs in
Yeah.
some sense, which I guess.
Yeah, or even like following the rules that it kind of like drift or French type of drift. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like the critique of like Platonic representation of everything has to be a non-ideal form of perfect.
Did you say Platonic representation? You did.
I didn't. He did.
Zani, you did?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Plato needs to be banished from the Republic. I've been debating a Platonist in the last few months. Can't deal anymore. I'm Platoed out. All right. So nobody
Wait,
posted.
there are still Platonists? Like you're debating a Platonist about what?
Oh, Plato has a. I was reminded that Alain Badiou is a Platonist. He's a student of Althusser. He's a Platonist, and he was all the rage just a few years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Further elaborations?
So the first bullet point, I strung together a couple different things he was saying that I thought related to each other. The part where he said art is inherently like conservative, not like fully conservative, but I didn't remember, I don't think I wrote down the quote, so there's no page number or actual quote, but they have an aspect of conservativeness always. And I was thinking of that through like the institution of art, but also like through the constraints of the aesthetic. But I thought it tied into society appears in art all the more authentically the less it is the intended subject. And catharsis is a purging action directed against the effects and an ally of repression. I thought that last part tied in with it being inherently conservative, as in even so much as you're speaking out, if you're doing so within this framework that demands certain things of you, it can be used to your disadvantage.
Right, it has a kind of rehabilitative or affirmative character. That's right. You know, and again, in some way, Adorno would be acknowledging, therefore, why there would be an impulse that would be anti-aesthetic or anti-art, even. In the 60s, specifically. So when he's writing, you know, I think that he mentions like happenings and fluxus is you know, an actual prominent presence, especially in the German-speaking world in the 60s. And again, if we use a sort of standard definition of avant-garde as it developed in the 20th century, so if modernism could be understood as art about art, then the avant-garde, if we were to distinguish modernism from the avant-garde, that the avant-garde would be critique of art's position in society, the function of art at all. So you would problematize all of that. And of course, Adorno wants to take that on board, meaning he doesn't want to ignore that. Because again, it's recurring in the 60s, but was already there in the early 20th century, that impulse. You know, with Dadaism and Surrealism and other avant-garde art of the time. Right, so if we were to say that art is mimetic and kind of enacting, then it would have this cathartic character to it. It would sort of again, the pathos would allow us to feel something. It would allow for a kind of discharge of social contradiction in a way that would leave society as it is.
The guy who talked about repressive desublimation.
Marcuse. Yeah, Marcuse. Yeah, repressive desublimation, which is kind of a Frankfurt School idea in general. So it certainly is an idea that he has in common with Adorno. Meaning, in comparison to the Victorianism of the late 19th and early 20th century, it would appear, starting after World War I, but then again after World War II, that, as he put in the Those 20s article, everything was permitted, right? And yet not in a way that was actually utopia. Right, so in other words, it looks like the old repressive framework was lifted, but without that actually leading to freedom. Right, so desublimated in the sense of no longer cathected, so it's a kind of Freudian idea, no longer invested or cathected, but sort of let loose. And so, you know, the fact that artists themselves might rebel against making art, that's a kind of curious phenomenon.
So in the early 20s, though, like how, I guess maybe this is something that's not entirely clear to me, like how sort of extensive or how widespread was like the initial reaction after World War I was to, you know, turn the world with And I see that as like kind of the opposite of what we're saying now. That's like self-repression on behalf of artists, you know, like going back to classicism, going back to representation. But it seems like, I don't know, the way we're talking about it now, it seems like we're kind of ignoring that, or skipping over the.
Well, it
return
splits in
development.
two different directions, right? So there's late modernism and a kind of 20th century avant-garde. And late modernism is what you're describing, which is a kind of, which Adorno also mentions, the sort of return to order from the freedom of the pre-World War I moment. And so there seems to be a kind of conservative, I mean, this is why the postmodernists emphasize the avant-garde over modernism, because they see modernism as more conservative. But what they have in mind is a kind of late modernism. Right? The model for that would be a kind of mid-20th century modernism. And it's definitely the modernism that was institutionalized. Right? So the postmodernists are, you know, again, if we go back to Susan Buck-Morss from the first week, the paradox that artists, in order to preserve the value of art, attack the institution that keeps alive the illusion that art exists. So like institutional critique. And that's the way the early 20th century avant-garde is understood. It's understood as some kind of institutional critique. But maybe that's like a little already domesticated. Like the idea that it's institutional critique might be a little domesticated. Maybe it was more radical than that. You know, so you mentioned Duchamp. Like maybe Duchamp is doing something more radical than just critiquing the institution of art.
I'm thinking like German expressionism in 20s, you know.
Yeah. Which has its origins before World War I. So Schoenberg, composer, he was an expressionist composer. He also painted, and his paintings are expressionist paintings. Right? And free atonality was aimed at finding expressive capacities for music, not to be found in conventional tonality. Right? So it's really meant to be psychological. It is supposed to be aesthetic. It is supposed to be emotional. There's supposed to be feeling.
Something talking about expressionism, I don't really sort of understand this, but I wanted to talk more about, Adorno's talking about the tendency of expressionism up to and including down to, of course, what he calls like the dimensionless point of pure subjectivity. And then he claims that it's only like really exemplary artists like Picasso or Klee or Schoenberg who break through this point. And I don't understand what that point is or what he thinks changes in those artists.
What page are you on?
I don't know.
And it's in this section that we wrote for today. It's in the society section.
Like 256, 57, around there.
Can you paraphrase again what you said? You said I didn't hear it.
Let's see.
The dimensionless point of pure subjectivity.
Oh no, maybe this is way back.
Yeah, it might be in a different section.
It totally.
That's
yeah,
okay.
I was reading.
Huh?
Picasso, Klee, and who else did you say wrote this?
Schoenberg.
Schoenberg.
This might be back in situation.
Might be in the first. Here, let me do a text search. Here we go. Yeah, it's in situation. Okay, check this out. Let's see where this starts. In art, what once took care of itself became a specific undertaking, and as a result, integration increasingly binds the centrifugal counterforces. Like a whirlpool, integration absorbs the manifold that wants to find art. What is left is an abstract unity shorn of the antithetical element by virtue of which art becomes a unity in the first place. The more successful the integration, the more it becomes an empty spinning of gears. Teleologically, it tends towards infantile tinkering. The power of the aesthetic subject to integrate whatever it takes hold of is at the same time its weakness. It capitulates to a unity that is alienated by virtue of its abstractness and resignedly casts its lot with blind necessity. If the whole of modern art can be understood as the perpetual intervention of the subject, one that is at no point disposed to allow the unreflected governance of the traditional play of forces within the artwork, the permanent interventions of the ego are matched by a tendency of the ego to abdicate out of weakness. True to the age-old mechanical principle of the bourgeois spirit, this abdication takes the form of the reification of subjective achievements, effectively locating them exterior to the subject and mistaking the abdication of the subject for a guarantee of ironclad objectivity. Technique, the extended arm of the subject, also always leads away from that subject. The shadow of art's autarkic radicalism is its harmlessness. Absolute color compositions verge on wallpaper patterns. Now that American hotels are decorated with abstract paintings a la manière de, and aesthetic radicalism has shown itself to be socially affordable, radicalism itself must pay the price that it is no longer radical. Among the dangers faced by new art, the worst is the absence of danger. The more art expels the pre-established, the more it is thrown back on what purports to get by, as it were, without borrowing from what has become distant and foreign. Art is thrown back on the dimensionless point of pure subjectivity, strictly in its own particular and thus abstract subjectivity. This tendency was passionately anticipated by the radical wing of Expressionism up to and including Dada. The absence of social resonance, however, was not alone to blame for the collapse of Expressionism. It was not possible to persevere within the bounds of a dimensionless point. The contraction of the accessible, the totality of the refusal, terminates in complete impoverishment. The scream, or the destitute, powerless gesture, literally the syllables Dada. This became an amusement for all concerned, the Dadaists as well as the conformists that they challenged, because it confessed the impossibility of artistic objectivation that is postulated by each and every artistic manifestation, whether intentionally or not. What, after all, is left to do but scream? The Dadaists consistently tried to abrogate this postulate. The program of their surrealist successors rejected art, yet without being able to shake itself free of it. Their truth was that it would be better not to have art than to have a false one. But they fell to the mercy of the semblance of a pure, or the phenomenon of an absolute subjectivity existing purely for itself and objectively mediated, yet without the ability to go beyond the position of being for itself. Surrealism expresses the foreignness of the alienated only by seeking recourse in itself. Mimesis ties art to individual human experience, which is now exclusively that for being for itself. That of being for itself. That there is no persevering at the subjective point is by no means only because the artwork forfeits that otherness in which the aesthetic subject is exclusively able to objectivate itself. Clearly, the concept of duration, as ineluctable as it is problematic, cannot be unified with the idea that the subjective point is also a temporal one. Not only did the Expressionists make concessions as they became older and had to earn a living, not only did Dadaists convert to Catholicism or enroll in the Communist Party, artists, with the integrity of Picasso and Schoenberg, went beyond the subjective point. Their difficulties in this could be sensed and feared right from their first efforts to achieve a so-called new order. Since then, these difficulties developed into the difficulties of art as such. To date, all requisite progress beyond the subjective point has been bought at the price of regression through assimilation to the past and by the arbitrariness of a self-posited order. In recent years, it has been fashionable to accuse Samuel Beckett of simply repeating his basic idea. He exposed himself to this accusation in a provocative fashion. In this, his consciousness was correct that the need for progress is inextricable from its impossibility. By the way, that's so the thought figure that recurs here, the necessity and impossibility of art. So art is impossible, but also remains necessary. And that formulation applies to many things, but we're dealing with it in terms of art. The gesture of walking in place at the end of Godot, waiting for Godot, which is the fundamental motif of the whole of his work, reacts precisely to this situation. Without exception, his response is violent. His work is the extrapolation of a negative kairos, I guess.
Did you say Kairos?
Yes. Seems to be what it is. It's a negative action. The fulfilled moment reverses into perpetual repetition that converges with desolation. His narratives, which he sardonically calls novels, no more offer objective descriptions of social reality than, as the widespread misunderstanding supposes, they present the reduction of life to basic human relationships, that minimum of existence that subsists in extremis. These novels do, however, touch on fundamental layers of experience, hic et nunc, which are brought together in a paradoxical dynamic at a standstill. That's a Benjamin idea, by the way, the dialectic at a standstill, or the dialectical image. The narratives are marked as much by an objectively motivated loss of the object as by its correlative, the impoverishment of the subject. Beckett draws the lesson from montage and documentation, from all attempts to free oneself from the illusion of a subjectivity that bestows meaning. Even where reality finds entry into the narrative, precisely at those points at which reality threatens to suppress what the literary subject once performed, it is evident that there is something uncanny about this reality. Its disproportion to the powerless subject, which makes it incommensurable with experience, renders reality unreal with a vengeance. So, to remind us, this category of experience goes all the way back to where we started the course, with Kant. So with Kant, what Kant was trying to do was establish the reality of the subject. Well, what subject? The subject of experience. So it was meant to overcome the problem of empiricism, which could only give you sense data perception at any discrete point in space and time. So it was to allow us to grasp experience. So what is experience? It's transformative, meaning the idea that one doesn't just have one damn thing after another, but that there's actually development, transformation through experience. The subject changes. The subject isn't just from moment to moment. Right, so, but that's exactly what's broken down that in capitalism, such that now art has to try to objectify that absence of experience, or that negation of experience. Right, that's the paradox. It has to try to make the absence of experience into an experience. The surplus of reality amounts to its collapse. By striking the subject dead, reality itself becomes deathly. This transition is the artfulness of all anti-art. And in Beckett, it is pushed to the point of the manifest annihilation of reality. The more total society becomes, the more completely it contracts to a unanimous system, and all the more do the artworks in which this experience is sedimented become the other of this society. If one applies the concept of abstraction in the vaguest possible sense, it signals the retreat from a world of which nothing remains except its caput mortuum. Now, new art, is as abstract as social relations have in truth become. In like manner, the concepts of the realistic and the symbolic are put out of service. Because the spell of external reality over its subjects and their reactions has become absolute, the artwork can only oppose this spell by assimilating itself to it. At ground zero, however, where Beckett's plays unfold like forces in infinitesimal physics, a second world of images springs forth, both sad and rich, the concentrate of historical experiences that otherwise, in their immediacy, fail to articulate the essential, the evisceration of subject and reality. The shabby, damaged world of images is the negative imprint of the administered world. To this extent, Beckett is realistic. Even in what passes vaguement under the name of abstract art, something survives of the tradition it effaced. Presumably, it corresponds to what one already perceives in traditional painting, insofar as one sees images and not copies of something. Art carries out the eclipse of concretion, an eclipse to which expression is refused by a reality in which the concrete continues to exist only as a mask of the abstract and determinate particular, of the abstract, and the determinate particular is nothing more than an exemplar of the universal that serves as its camouflage and is fundamentally identical with the ubiquity of monopoly. So there's a phrase in the fetish character in music and the regression of listening that we looked at briefly alongside for an informal music, where he says all music sounds like Parsifal did to Nietzsche's ear. It recalls incomprehensible rites and is provocative nonsense. Right, so that would not only be music, that would also be aesthetic experience writ large. This critique of pseudo-concreteness directs its barbs retrospectively at the whole of art as it has come down to the present. The tangents of the empirical world need only be slightly extended to see that they converge in the insight that the concrete serves for nothing better than that something, by being in some way distinct, can be identified, possessed, and sold. The marrow of experience has been sucked out. There is none, not even that apparently severed or removed from commerce, that has not been gnawed away. At the heart of the economy is a process of concentration and centralization that has the power to absorb what is scattered. It leaves traces of independent existences only for professional statistics and permeates the most subtle spiritual innervations, often without it being possible to perceive the mediations. The mendacious personalization of politics and the blather about man in the age of inhumanity are appropriate to the objective pseudo-individualization. But this becomes an unbearable burden for art because there is no art without individuation. That's an interesting observation that he makes. That it's just when the social realm is so completely dominated by abstract forces that politics becomes personalized to such an extreme degree. It's kind of a paradox, right? So just when the individual person matters least, politics becomes most about the personal.
He also talks about art becoming more about the personal and aesthetic experience. Like how does he put it? It's like the collapse of the difference between the artistic subject and the empirical person.
Right, right. That it becomes a private, like a kind of, the experience becomes private. And which is, in some ways, the opposite of the hermetic in art, which would put, like, the principle of the artwork into, like, a kind of an occult realm that isn't about, like, personal psychology, and yet also seems to be precisely where personal psychology goes. You know, it's sort of the cult of the individual.
Chris, can we
Yeah.
talk for just a moment about like the aesthetics of like Adorno's prose?
Uh-huh.
Like, I don't know, 'cause Like, it's horrible writing, actually. Like, the fact that they're not paragraphs makes it exhausting. It feels like an assembly line. I read 3 pages and I need a nap, you know?
You know, it's not supposed to be like this. So I know the translator, Robert Hewlett Cantor. He's problematic. It's problematic. So he literally decided to render this unreadable.
Why didn't he say vaguely instead of
Vaguement. It probably was French in the German, right? So basically, non-German words are rendered in their original language in the translation. So Adorno would sprinkle non-German words in his prose, because vaguement has like an aesthetic association with like French discourse around art and literature. Yeah, it's, you know, and it's the same reason why he puts the Greek as Greek. I used to always just say, whenever I would encounter one of those Greek phrases, I would pronounce it huevos rancheros, because everything in Greek is like os, right? Right? So, huevos rancheros. Because it's like kairos or eidos or telos, or like there's just all these os. So, and I can't ever quite read Greek. Like I have to sort of remind myself, oh yeah, what is that word supposed to be again? But that's the reason why. It's because in the original German that he has like non-German. He has English words too. I think the English they're all in italics. Go ahead.
No, I'm not fully convinced why the French word is
Necessary? Because it refers again to aesthetic discourse, like, and
That's such a mundane word.
it is a very mundane word. But to get back to the style question, so first of all, I know from Adorno's other writings that if he had published this, if he had lived and published it, then these like interminable paragraphs that are not indented when the paragraph change happens, they're not indented, so you have to look for where it's not justified on the right to see where the paragraph break happens, that there would be paragraphs actually, that these are like mini essays and there would probably be paragraphs within them. Right, so if you look at his book Negative Dialectics, it has a very similar structure, but is totally readable.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And there would be titles, right? So the titles for each section are only in the table of contents. So the titles would be there in the text. And Hewlett Cantor was like, no. He's like, we don't want Adorno to be easy to read. We want people to face the difficulty of Adorno. And I was like,
It's so stupid.
it's so stupid. It's so
And
stupid.
it's like
Yeah.
alienating. It's like actually going
Yeah.
against like the whole goal
Right.
of doing an exercise like this.
So there's that problem. There's a typographic problem. There's a layout problem. The other problem is that this is not finished. This is not finished work. So there are some sentences that are literally like placeholders where he would have elaborated more. Right? There are some. So it's just not. It's not a completed work. Like it alternates between passages that are pretty much finished and kind of notes.
Only someone who already understands what he's saying can read and understand.
That's possible. Yeah, that's possible.
Because it's impossible to like actually learn the concepts one after the other continuously with this type of work.
That might be true.
It doesn't actually want anyone who hasn't already had access to a way of understanding this information.
Yeah, he's peacocking.
Yeah.
You know,
You think so?
He's peacocking and masturbating at the same time. I really think like that's the only way to interpret writing like this. 10 pages without a paragraph break. No, thank you. You know?
No, like I said, that's not Adorno's fault. That's not Adorno's fault. But anyway, so let me make a plea for, like, pedagogically, like, it's a challenge that I gave myself, and, with my colleagues here, like, Chris, why don't you teach Adorno's aesthetic theory? And I was like, that might be difficult, but let's try. Okay, so let's try, meaning like let's read everything that would be like the absolute minimum you would have to read before you could begin to read aesthetic theory.
Yeah.
And that's how the course was structured. But that was the challenge. The challenge was like Chris, why don't you teach aesthetic theory? And I was like, yeah, I don't know if that's a great idea, but I'll try it, you know.
But I don't know if it was in the introduction or somewhere I was reading or something online, maybe, there have been translators who've broken it up.
Yes.
To try to make it more legible.
Yes.
I'm just curious.
There's another translation that exists. That's right. And
Okay.
why didn't I use that one?
Yeah, I'm wondering
it's
why
less accurate.
It's less accurate.
Like, to its core, we all have access to this information because it's speaking to a very fundamental aspect of the way human beings think.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about it in class, it's like, it all makes sense.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, do Adorno scholars, like, have an opinion that this is a problem? Like, we need a new translation, actually? Like, we need a broken up translation, but that's also a good translation? Because, like, this is not...
Yeah, people have complained. Yeah,
What's
people have complained. I'm not the only one to have complained.
No, but I'm saying, like, like, as a serious scholarly project, like, is there a desire amongst Adorno heads to, like, retranslate this text, or are they happy with this?
Or repaginate it.
Yeah, repaginate it, break it up into paragraphs, you know, or is this considered fine?
People have not taken it upon themselves.
Because they don't struggle with the desire to access things.
And I probably am one of the only people who does try to teach aesthetic theory in the world. Like, not just in the United States, not just in the Anglophone world, but in the world. No, it's become a kind of a funny, weird cult object. You know, the Frankfurt School, like Benjamin and Adorno, are like these funny, like, cultural commodities, right? And I mean, I spoke on a panel with other Adorno scholars a number of years ago in New York at the New School, and I was taken to task by the other panelists. They were like, Chris, you're saying that Adorno and Benjamin are saying things, whereas their whole point is the impossibility of saying anything. And I was like, what foolishness is this? Like, obviously Adorno's saying things. Obviously Benjamin, like, obviously there was like a point. They were trying to communicate something, right? It wasn't like, it wasn't a Dada poem. It wasn't some kind of self-deconstruction. No, it's not, right? But these were like established Adorno scholars who insisted on like, you can't make Adorno accessible. And it's like, come on. Adorno had a radio show. Like, we read lyric poetry in society. He wanted to be understood. He was interviewed on TV. He wrote for popular like magazines and newspapers. Like, he wanted to communicate.
Well, I think teaching aesthetic theory is like really important, especially today, because it gives people access to themselves.
Yes. But we have to start with Kant. In other words, like, definitely, you know, we're dealing with Kant and the Kantian aftermath, to use Robert Pippin's expression.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning this might all be marginal notes on Kant, everything that we read in this course. You know, Schiller for sure, Hegel, Nietzsche.
Well, Kant really like opens up the discussion. And like a very like, I mean, the discourse isn't digestible, but like conceptually digestible.
I mean, but these are also ruptures. Like, Hegel is a rupture from Kant, and Nietzsche is a rupture from Hegel.
Sure, but you can't understand that rupture without understanding.
No, of course, no, absolutely.
Mark, I would challenge you on that one.
I saw your face.
Yeah, because no. I mean, you know, I'm very expressive. I don't know, I'm Italian American, whatever.
But it's like if
But
Kant disagreed with everything that he said, which is what he would have to do in order to like fully,
right.
then nothing would be something would be way too, like you could go in every single possible direction that you could possibly go in, but you kind of have to like decide a bias, not a bias, but like narrow down the depth of like how you're going to talk about a specific thing and allow it to be interpreted. And
It's dialogue. It's
Yeah.
not just rupture.
Yeah.
It's dialogue. They're all in dialogue with Kant. They're not rupturing. Rupturing is a very postmodernist sort of optimism/pessimism or something. Well, if we've ruptured, it's because capitalism has ruptured.
Or I don't necessarily think, it maybe we depends what we think of rupture means. Like, to me, a rupture is not like a complete severance. It's not like my arm gets cut off. It's more like my arm gets cut open. You know, like a rupture is like a break in the skin. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like an abandonment. You know, That's the sense in which I say that they're ruptured.
Crisis of Kantian aesthetics. We've been living in the crisis of Kantian aesthetics for 200 years. And that's a local phenomenon of the crisis of bourgeois society. Right? The crisis of the bourgeois subject. And art has instantiated that. And it's instantiated it in more and more radical ways until the more recent period where the radicalism seemed to come to a halt. So maybe up through the 70s there was a certain kind of radicalism. Not so much since then. And I also, I mentioned that I blame postmodernist discourse. Also, postmodernist discourse probably would have been a problem in and of itself. It didn't help that it became academically normative, right? So the postmodernists, I'm not sure that they intended to become the new canon of academia. It's very paradoxical that Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze even, Lacan, just became academicized. They were very anti-academic. And yet they became the new academic.
But
They also kind of touch on that in the writing, that as when things get formalized, they become classified, and it strays away from the original attempt or desire to understand things.
They're no longer critical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But do you think, I wonder if with these kinds of things, I wonder if we're a little bit maybe hitting lost in one sauce a little bit. By which I mean is it really true that Foucault is institutionalized? Yes, if you're a
Totally.
if you're a humanities scholar, sure. But if if you didn't go into
Even the social sciences.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that most people would turn to mainstream psychology to answer the kinds of questions Foucault is interested in, and you've probably never even heard of Foucault. I'm not sure that it's as widespread as maybe the name would sound outside of.
How about artists?
What's that?
How about artists? I think artists have suffered from the institutionalization of postmodernism. That would be my provocation.
Artists and philosophers.
Yeah, maybe philosophers, but artists. Let's stick with artists. Philosophers, I don't know, because philosophy is a very wide field. There is philosophy that's not continental philosophy. So, but artists. I told you guys I got my MFA here. And I was in undergrad when postmodernism was kind of arriving on the scene, where I was a Marxist, and my peers and some of my professors were like, oh, Marxism is so passé, it's Foucault now, Foucault. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, right? And then I came here, and it was just total, complete, October Art Journal, Foucauldian, up the yin-yang, 100%. And I was like, no. I was like, Adorno says, blah. Right? And I think I told you guys when I came back here to teach, I thought, oh, thank God that postmodernism is over. 2004, right? 21 years ago. And yeah, no, I guess maybe not. I don't know. So, in other words...
You discovered a need for it.
Well, or lack of imagination. Or kind of discursive, just, I don't know, jargon. Jargon takes on a life of its own. So, anyway, I always like to say that all the postmodernists in the end said that they never got beyond Kant anyway. I think that they all said that. Foucault, Derrida, even Deleuze. They all sort of at the end, and certainly the October Art Journal people all at the end were like, yeah, we've tried to get beyond Kant, but there's no getting beyond Kant.
I mean, in what sense? Because that's hard for me to understand. Because, again, for me, I see someone who really gets Hegel as already having, ways to escape from Kant. The dialectic in itself is a radical pivot away from Kant's.
Kant's dialectical. We did that, didn't we? Kant's the dialectic. It's the same dialectic. Kant is the dialectician.
What I mean is the historical sort of aspect of it, the fact that it's this mobile, changing thing, whereas for Kant we're dealing with frozen absolutes, we're dealing with categories that don't change.
Kant's not Plato. Kant's not Plato. Kant's historical too. It's just that history didn't quite take on the urgency for Kant that it did for Hegel. You know, there was an urgency, and there was a new sort of historicism with Romanticism that was not quite there with Classicism. Right? But yeah, Kant. The whole point of Kant is to recognize that things have changed.
Yeah, but isn't the category of the a priori itself sort of like counter-dialectical or like non-historical or ahistorical? At least the way that's taken Kant.
We're very traumatized by the a priori. I think the first time I taught this course, I think I said something like, when you like hear the word a priori, it's like a thunderclap from Mount Olympus or something. You know, it's like the a priori.
And
You
then,
know.
because a priori in French is a very, very common thing to say.
Right.
In any sentence.
Exactly, that's right. So, so in English, it's like reified or something,
Yeah.
in a way that, because I think that I might have mentioned this when we were reading Kant, that Kant is writing German, but as if it's French, meaning it's still Enlightenment. It's still like a kind of Latinate German, right? It's still the Republic of Letters, So again, the a priori is not supposed to strike terror. It's supposed to be much more ordinary, in the sense of, well, what precedes any empirical sense data perception? Right? Like the a priori. It's kind of like the subject. It's kind of like, "Da." Well, wait, but we are subjects, aren't we? Right? It's not like the subject. It's not like Foucault's telling us that the panopticon is what's making us the subject. It's like the subject is like, what's his name, Roddy McDowell in The Clockwork Orange. It's like the subject means that your eyes are pried open or something. It's like, no, you're a subject. It's like...
Basically it just means you haven't seen it, but in theory, that's what it should be.
Right. That you are a kind of hypothetical subject of experience going into any experience. And that subject changes, that the subject changes. And that the fact that the subject changes doesn't mean that there is no subject. The fact that the truth changes doesn't mean that there is no truth.
Right, but to defend Foucault a little bit here, I don't think he's necessarily, maybe finding me a citation, I don't think he's saying that there is no subject in that the way you kind of put it just now. I think he's talking about essentiality of the subject. The subject is produced. It's not that the subject doesn't exist, it's that the subject is produced.
Surely.
It's not a priori.
Well, more importantly, the subject is not a subject of freedom, but a subject of power and discipline.
Early Foucault, late Foucault, he finds freedom again.
He does find freedom again, and that's why the encyclopedia entry he writes on himself says, the work of Michel Foucault is all about Kant, and ultimately dealing with all of Kant's problems. Do you know that?
No, I don't.
No, it's I forget what the pseudonym is. So he wrote like a pseudonymous encyclopedia entry on himself.
This was published where?
Published where?
Well, I just mean, like, where did one find such a thing?
Let's see. Not self-surveillance. See what Google does? Google's gonna insist that it's power, knowledge, discourse. Is it self-description? What would you call it? So AI has to tell us. No, AI is going to fail us. Because AI is stupid.
self-synopsis.
Yeah. See, the thing is, AI tries to be too smart. So no one has heard of this except me. I don't want to be like a Foucault scholar. Like, this is horrible. You guys are supposed to be the Foucault scholars.
No,
I'm
man,
supposed to be
you know the
the.
deep cuts, not us.
Huh?
You know the deep cuts, not us.
Yeah, that's true too. That's why I'm a professor. But yeah. This is a famous. Come on. Let's do it this way. Grammar of Google sucks. No, this is not an M thing. I think it's another one. Anyway.
I'll look for it.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me know that it exists.
Yeah, it exists. And it's from like 1984 or something. Yeah, it's from towards the end of his life. Let's take a short break, stretch our legs, and then we'll come back and look at the final section of aesthetic theory.
How much forgiveness do you have if we maybe misinterpret something a little?
Well, it depends on what you do with it. Yeah.
So I have a question. So with the fourth, you said there's a fourth option of like choosing on topic, but if that were to be the case, you still want it to be exegetical, or?
Yeah. So still based on the readings, but not necessarily bound within the 3 segments of the course. If you want to sort of transcend the chronological divisions, for instance. All right, let's look at this last bit of aesthetic theory, because it's where he broaches a prognosis on the future, potentially. All right, so he reaches back, but he also looks ahead. So prior to the emancipation of the subject, what does that refer to? That's the bourgeois subject. The emancipation of the subject. That's the bourgeois subject. That's when art is art, as opposed to something else. Autonomous as opposed to heteronymous. Because prior to the emancipation of the subject, art was undoubtedly, in a certain sense, more immediately social than it was afterward. Now, we already had the idea that art might be most social when it appears to be not at all, or when it seems to be rejecting society completely, or trying to separate itself most vehemently from society, that might be the most social expression of art. And here he's talking about that a little bit differently. Its autonomy, its growing independence from society, was a function of bourgeois consciousness of freedom that was itself bound up with the social structure. Prior to the emergence of this consciousness, art certainly stood in opposition to social domination and its mores, but not with an awareness of its own independence. So I think that we looked at the Trotsky, The Art and Politics in Our Epoch, where Trotsky said art is a protest against reality, and I said that there are 2 senses of that. One is in capitalism, it's a protest against reality, but also you could say that any aesthetic objectification has, to use Kant's expression, an aesthetic ideal character to it, and therefore is implicitly opposed to reality, to empirical reality. Right, so Adorno's admitting that. There had been conflicts between art and society, desultorily, ever since art was condemned in Plato's state. But the idea of a fundamentally oppositional art was inconceivable. And social controls worked much more immediately than in the bourgeois era, at least until the rise of totalitarian states. On the other hand, the bourgeoisie integrated art much more completely than any previous society had. So this is dialectics. Under the pressure of an intensifying nominalism, the ever-present yet latent social character of art was made increasingly manifest. The social character is incomparably more evident in the novel than it was in the highly stylized and remote epics of chivalry. So we talked about how the novel was half art, half not art, the half not art being journalism. And so kind of reportage. Now, nominalism. So nominalism would be, there are two senses. One is a kind of medieval scholastic theological philosophy. It's capital N nominalism, but then there's lowercase n nominalism, which is literally like whatever you call it. So, meaning, do we think that art is simply a label? Yes, we do, right? So we think that art is whatever we say it is. That would be nominalism. Now, the relationship between that kind of ordinary nominalism and medieval scholastic theological philosophical nominalism is that each of God's creations has its own logic, has its own rule, has its own name because it has its own rule. Right, so all of God's particular creations follow whatever God's intention for that creation is. So there's that nominalism, and then there's the nominalism of we just call things what they are, and that's how they get their classification. It's kind of the arbitrariness of it. So that in that term nominalism, which shows up in the text in a number of places, there's supposed to be this tension between divine intention and human arbitrariness. And the reason for that is that we no longer have the Kantian or Hegelian idea of spirit as progress in consciousness of freedom, meaning our doing. So art has reverted to a divine status and a merely human conventional status at one and the same time. The influx of experiences that are no longer forced into a priori genres, the requirement of constituting form out of these experiences, that is, from below, this is realistic in purely aesthetic terms, regardless of content. No longer sublimated by the principle of stylization, the relation of content to the society from which it derives at first becomes much less refracted. And this is not only the case in literature. The so-called lower genres, too, held their distance from society, even when, like Attic comedy, they made bourgeois relations and the events of daily life thematic. The flight into no man's land is not just one of Aristophanes' antics, but rather an essential element of his form. So we've talked about refraction, I think. Did we talk about the windowless monad and the prism, the prismatic, and the monadological? Just to flag that word, refracted. If in one regard as a product of the social labor of spirit, art is always implicitly a fait social or a social fact. That's a Durkheim sociology expression of social fact. In becoming bourgeois art, its social aspect was made explicit. The object of bourgeois art is the relation of itself as artifact to empirical society. Don Quixote stands at the beginning of this development. Art, however, so that's an interesting case. Let's unpack that a little bit. So Don Quixote is a kind of a feudal relic, right? So he himself as a character is a kind of artifact. Art, however, is social not only because of its mode of production, in which the dialectic of the forces of production is concentrated, nor simply because of the social derivation of its thematic material. Much more importantly, art becomes social by its opposition to society, and occupies this position only as autonomous art. By crystallizing in itself as something unique to itself, rather than complying with existing social norms and qualifying as socially useful, it criticizes society by merely existing, for which Puritans of all stripes condemn it. Still, there is nothing pure, nothing structured strictly according to its own immanent law that does not implicitly criticize the debasement of a situation evolving in the direction of a total exchange society in which everything is heteronymously defined. Art's asociality is the determinate negation of a determinate society. Certainly through its refusal of society, which is equivalent to sublimation through the law of form, autonomous art makes itself a vehicle of ideology. The society at which it shudders is left in the distance, undisturbed. Yet this is more than ideology. Society is not only the negativity that the aesthetic law of form condemns, but also, even in its most objectionable shape, the quintessence of self-producing and self-reproducing human life. So as bad as capitalism can get, it still is perpetuating human life. And indeed, perpetuating human life more than any other society previously.
Not anymore.
Not anymore?
Not anymore.
Yeah.
Certainly not in the future.
Do you agree with Elon Musk?
Not on any points where what's one you're talking about.
Population collapse?
No, I'm not talking about population collapse. I'm talking about ecological and social breakdown, the situation.
Oh yeah, that will proceed, but there will still be more humans.
Yeah, but I don't think that. Yeah, but capitalism won't be this like fostering force. It'll be a gratuitous force.
Certainly, it's both. Art was no more able to dispense with this element than with critique, until that moment when the social process revealed itself as one of self-annihilation. And it is not in the power of art, which does not make judgments, to separate these two elements intentionally. Right, so this is an important point. So the problem, the Marxist issue with capitalism, is not that it destroys humans. All human societies, all cultures have destroyed humans. It's that it destroys itself. It's a societal form that is self-destructive. It's not just destructive of nature or of humans. It's self-destructive in a way that no other society was. And that is its possibility for transformation, the fact that it's self-destructive. The fact that it destroys humans and nature doesn't point beyond itself, doesn't point to any transformation. It's the fact that it's self-destructive. Capital destroys capital. That's what makes it dialectical and possibly changeable. A pure productive force, such as that is the aesthetic that we discussed earlier, once freed from heteronymous control, is objectively the counter-image of enchained forces. But it is also the paradigm of fateful self-interested doings. Art keeps itself alive through its social force of resistance. Unless it reifies itself, it becomes a commodity. So, in other words, it is a commodity, and its only solution to its commodity status is to further reify itself. Its contribution to society is not communication with it, but rather something extremely mediated. It is resistance in which, by virtue of inner aesthetic development, social development is reproduced without being imitated. So art for art's sake could be understood as a proxy for humanity's sake, that kind of humanistic impulse of bourgeois society, or it could be capital for capital's sake. Right, so it has both of those antithetical meanings. At the risk of its self-alienation, radical modernity preserves art's immanence by admitting society only in an obscured form, as in the dreams with which artworks have always been compared. Nothing social in art is immediately social, not even when this is its aim. Not long ago, even the socially committed Brecht found that to give his political position artistic expression, it was necessary to distance himself precisely from that social reality at which his works took aim. Jesuitical machinations were needed sufficiently to camouflage what he wrote as socialist realism, to escape the Inquisition. Music betrays all art. Just as in music, society, its movement, and its contradictions appear only in shadowy fashion. Speaking out of it, indeed, yet in need of identification, so it is with all other arts. That's definitely one of those passages that would have been elaborated further.
Sorry, what did you mean by Inquisition?
The purges, the Communist Party, self-discipline, self-criticism. Right, so there's a conversation that Walter Benjamin recorded with Brecht, where Brecht said that he had a dream, and in the dream he was brought before a party tribunal, and the party tribunal asked him whether he was more committed to politics or to art, and he confessed that he was more committed to art than to politics. Whenever art seems to copy society, it becomes all the more an as-if. For opposite reasons, Brecht's China in The Good Woman of Sichuan is no less stylized than Schiller's Messina in The Bride of Messina. All moral judgments on the characters in novels or plays have been senseless, even when these judgments have justly taken the empirical figures behind the work as their targets. Discussions about whether a positive hero can have negative traits are as foolish as they sound to anyone who overhears them from so much as the slightest remove. Form works like a magnet that orders elements of the empirical world in such a fashion that they are estranged from their extra-aesthetic existence. And it is only as a result of this estrangement that they master the extra-aesthetic essence. Conversely, by exploiting these elements, the culture industry all the more successfully joins slavish respect for empirical detail, the gapless semblance of photographic fidelity, with ideological manipulation. What is social in art is its immanent movement against society, not its manifest opinions. Its historical gesture repels empirical reality, of which our works are nevertheless part, in that they are things. Insofar as a social function can be predicated for our works, it is their functionlessness. Through their difference from a bewitched reality, they embody negatively a position in which what is would find its rightful place, its own. Their enchantment is disenchantment. Their social essence requires a double reflection on their being for themselves and on their relations to society. Their double character is manifest at every point. They change and contradict themselves. It was plausible that socially progressive critics should have accused the program of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, which has often been in league with political reaction, of promoting a fetish with the concept of a pure, exclusively self-sufficient artwork. What is true in this accusation is that artworks, products of social labor that are subject to or produce their own law of form, seal themselves off from what they themselves are. To this extent, each artwork can be charged with false consciousness and chalked up to ideology. In formal terms, independent of what they say, they are ideology, in that a priori they posit something spiritual, geistig, as being independent from the conditions of its material production, and therefore as being intrinsically superior and beyond the primordial guilt of the separation of physical and spiritual labor. What is exalted on the basis of this guilt is at the same time debased by it. This is why artworks with truth content do not blend seamlessly with the concept of art. Polar theorists like Valery have pointed this out. But the guilt they bear of fetishism does not disqualify art any more so than it disqualifies anything culpable. For in the universally socially mediated world, nothing stands external to its nexus of guilt. The truth content of our works, which is indeed their social truth, is predicated on their fetish character. The principle of heteronomy, apparently the counterpart of fetishism, is the principle of exchange, and in it, domination is masked. Only what does not submit to that principle acts as the plenipotentiary of what is free from domination. Only what is useless can stand in for the stunted use value. Artworks are plenipotentiaries of things that are no longer distorted by exchange, profit, and the false needs of a degraded humanity. In the context of total semblance or total appearance, art's semblance of being in itself is the mask of truth. Marx's scorn for the pittance Milton received for Paradise Lost, a work that did not appear to the market as socially useful labor, is, as a denunciation of useful labor, the strongest defense of art against its bourgeois functionalization, which is perpetuated in art's undialectical social condemnation. A liberated society would be beyond the irrationality of its faux phrase, the incidental costs, and beyond the ends means rationality of utility. This is enciphered in art and is the source of art's social explosiveness. Although the magic fetishes are one of the historical roots of art, a fetishistic element remains admixed in artworks, an element that goes beyond commodity fetishism. Artworks can neither exclude nor deny this. Even socially, the emphatic element of semblance or appearance in artworks is, as a corrective, the organon of truth. Artworks that do not insist fetishistically on their coherence, as if they were the absolute that they are unable to be, are worthless from the start. But the survival of art becomes precarious as soon as it becomes conscious of its fetishism, and as has been the case since the middle of the 19th century, insists obstinately on it. So that's modernism. Art cannot advocate delusion by insisting that otherwise art would not exist. This forces art into an aporia. All that succeeds in going even minutely beyond it is insight into the rationality of its irrationality. Artworks that want to divest themselves of fetishism by real and extremely dubious political commitment regularly enmesh themselves in false consciousness as the result of inevitable and vainly praised simplification. In the short-sighted praxis to which they blindly subscribe, their own blindness is prolonged. Jump to the final paragraph.
Quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of at the beginning of the passage you read, so when he talks about the emancipation of the bourgeois subject, are we talking like strictly in aesthetic terms, meaning mid-19th century, or is he talking about the revolutionary period as like the emancipation of the subject?
He means the end of traditional civilization. So he means bourgeois emancipation, the revolt of the Third Estate, the emancipation of labor, end of serfdom, end of slavery.
The reason I ask that is because I'm wondering, like, how do you think you would deal with a figure like Goya, who seems to kind of like be out of place in terms of this discussion? Unless the emancipation of the subject is French Revolution, and then we're kind of in Goya kind of fits in the window, I suppose.
Well, okay, so let's talk about this. So here's the difficulty. The French Revolution didn't, inaugurate bourgeois society. It ratified it. So, again, bourgeois society started in the Renaissance and developed within the old political order, but it transformed that political order already. So here's one important point. The absolute monarchy is a bourgeois state because it's about the alliance between the bourgeoisie and the monarch against the church and the aristocracy. So it's the king using the bourgeoisie subdues the church and the aristocracy. So the Protestant Reformation is bound up in this. I think I told you guys, did I tell you guys I was watching like a kind of schlocky series, but it was actually pretty good, The Tudors, about Henry VIII. And so it's all about like the religious conflict. It's all about like Protestantism and Catholicism and like which way is he leaning? Is Henry VIII leaning towards the Catholics or is he leaning towards the Protestants? And then he's setting up his own kind of Protestantism that isn't as radical as the radical Protestants. And he's like killing everybody. He's like killing the Catholics, the Protestants. He's like killing everybody. All of his like top advisors end up head chopped. And then also his wives, because they're the political alliances with the various different factions. But that's bourgeois society. In other words, what's depicted in the Tudors is the fact that the king is leaning on the bourgeoisie now against the aristocracy and the church. So that's already happening, right? That's before Elizabeth, right? So Elizabethan England is total bourgeois society. Shakespeare, that's total bourgeois society already. So what has happened with like Marxism in the 20th century is because of the Russian and Chinese revolutions, these things got telescoped, and then the French Revolution got turned into the beginning of bourgeois society. Actually, it's the end of bourgeois society because it's happening in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. Right, so those revolutions come at the end of a historical development. I think that we talked about this with Trotsky, which is Trotsky pointed out that it's the reverse with socialism, which is that socialism doesn't develop within capitalism the way bourgeois society developed within feudalism. So you don't have socialism developing in capitalism. All that you have is the working class constituting itself as a political subject, as a party, and as a revolutionary force, but that's all capitalism. That's actually all capitalism. And then the dictatorship of the proletariat takes over capitalism. So I think I mentioned to you guys that if I called up the Chinese Communist Party right now and said, comrades, what are you doing over there? And they would say, Comrade Cutrone, we're doing the dictatorship of the proletariat. What are you doing over there in America? And I would say, doing my best, comrades, doing my best. Right? Meaning they don't claim to be socialist. They don't. Right? Why? Because the revolution takes over capitalism. It doesn't inaugurate socialism. It takes over capitalism. It remains capitalism because there's a gradual transition from capitalism to socialism. It's not like you kill all the capitalists and then that's the end of capitalism. No. That's not how it works. So Trotsky extrapolated that to art by saying that the radical art movements were not socialistic. They were modernism. They were capitalist art and bourgeois culture that persists, right? So, you know, the idea was that when workers become artists, they become bourgeois artists. Like there's no such thing as proletarian art. No. There might be propagandistically revolutionary art, but it's still basically capitalist modernist art. That's what Adorno's perspective is. Adorno's perspective is that modernism is capitalist art, and even leftist art is still modernist art. It's not something else.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So I guess my question then is like, so if we're thinking about the bourgeois period as, you know,
Long.
Yeah, like 16th century, you know, whatever, late 15th century even. I guess the question is like, why did we have to wait until the 19th century to see this effect?
Industrial Revolution. Meaning it's a very Hegelian idea, which is that when bourgeois society completes itself, it immediately negates itself. In other words, the Industrial Revolution is both the fulfillment of bourgeois society and its self-contradiction. Right, so when bourgeois society attains to its concept, it's already in crisis and pointing beyond itself. Right, that's, by the way, that's why with Hegel it's not the triad, it's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not Hegel at all. That's Fichte. It's not at all Hegel. It's not Kant either. Right, so it's something else. Right. Because it's the self-overcoming. It's not, again, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's, Lenin called it the wooden trichotomies, which are undialectical.
What did you mean that kind of thing?
Mechanical, inflexible. But you were bringing that up for.
Well,
Finish the thought.
I was thinking about this emancipation date as being either the revolution or like the rise of modern art. And then with that in mind, Goya seemed too early.
Well, Goya's a romantic, for sure, right?
But in terms of
So romanticism is definitely a kind of high moment in bourgeois art, but that's also going into crisis, right? Meaning, classicism would be the highest expression of bourgeois art, and then romanticism is a transition into its crisis. And that's why there's a sense of, like, of art that sort of can't instantiate what it seeks to be. But what did you have in mind from Goya in particular?
Oh, we're just thinking about like disasters of war and these sort of like, sort of late Goya, which is very antagonistic to society.
Well, it's got a pathos. You mean it's anti-heroic?
It's anti-heroic, it's also, it's anti-establishment. Right?
For sure.
Anti-empire, these sorts of things.
Well, it's anti-Napoleon, yeah.
Anti-Napoleon, yeah.
I was thinking similarly with this, struggling to understand Adorno speaking about the content of the art being less political than
The form.
And especially with overtly political works like this, how you navigate that.
Right. So on the one hand, this could just be seen as like some kind of Spanish, like nationalistic, like anti-Napoleonic, tyranny, right? But it has, this is recognizably bourgeois, like humanistic.
I guess I'm thinking more of like its plates, like this disaster, and what's the other one?
So these drawings
Riccios.
seem less redemptive.
Yeah, less redemptive, much more sort of just like almost nihilistic or like absolutely antagonistic to the social form surrounding him. And I think I'd have to go back to him, but I think in the Disastros, I think it's not he's not just depicting French crimes. He's also showing partisan violence against
Right.
the invaders.
It's more universal. Yeah, it's the kind of depredation, it's the degradation of humanity.
Yeah.
That's what Adorno is for.
Not in a nationalistic way, but in a universal way.
I have suddenly in mind, let's see if they have. Yeah, they're a little bit darker.
The one with the trees, I'm saying.
Let me see if they have that or not. Oh, like this one? Not exactly apocalyptic either.
Well, that one wasn't Goya that was just like that, was it?
Oh no, you're right.
That's
It's
earlier.
sure. Hello.
Apparently I know my horrible illustration, horrific illustration.
So this is what you mean.
Yeah, and there's
This is what you
artist
mean.
media has a
This
scope.
is what you mean. Sorry. It suggests modernity. Again, it's like sort of a hinge between the kind of bourgeois humanism and the later modernism.
Well, I guess the reason it troubles, it's one artist, so who cares? But the reason it troubles me is because of his mechanical, sort of historical or mechanical explanation of how this transformation comes about, right? Like, it's not like artists making super subjective choices about what they want to represent. It's social forces acting themselves out through artists.
Uh-huh.
So, like, why is Goya the only person doing this? The question.
Is he the only one doing it though?
I mean, mine now? Maybe not? I don't know. Was there a period of this kind of grotesque? Early modern.
I'm wondering how much is
Jericho
also
makes me.
what art gets preserved has something to do with it. Maybe there was a lot of other people making stuff
Sure.
like this,
Yeah.
but he was the only one
I mean, the black
institutionally.
painting almost didn't make it in the
Yeah.
So that's a good point.
It could just be his sort of exceptional standing as an artist that anywhere that knows about the sort of signed works that were more out of step with
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would be interested to know.
Who's the painter who does the severed heads? I thought it was Jericho, but they don't have it here. But it may not be one of his more famous things anyway.
Was Delacroix considered grotesque?
Delacroix?
Yeah.
Some is, but
What was the question?
Delacroix, whether he would fit into this.
Oh.
I need a lot of work from him about
Yeah, but I feel like his was more affirmative, like nationalistic, like like the triumph of history, right? Like Washington crossing the Delaware,
That's more classicism though, right? That's
But
more
that's
like
Delacroix.
David. No, Delacroix is a little different. Delacroix is somewhat different because it does transcend both classicism and romanticism. It's realism. Let's end on a strong note with the final sentences of aesthetic theory. If today art has become the ideological complement of a world not at peace, it is possible that the art of the past will someday devolve upon society at peace. It would, however, amount to the sacrifice of its freedom, were new art to return to peace and order, to affirmative replication and harmony. Nor is it possible to sketch the form of art in a changed society. In comparison with past art and the art of the present, it will probably again be something else. But it would be preferable that some fine day art vanish altogether, than that it forget the suffering that is its expression and in which form has its substance. The suffering is the humane content that unfreedom counterfeits as positivity. If in fulfillment of the wish, a future art were once again to become positive, then the suspicion that negativity were in actuality persistent would become acute. The suspicion is ever present, regression threatens unremittingly, and freedom, surely freedom from the principle of possession, cannot be possessed. But then what would art be as the writing of history if it shook off the memory of accumulated suffering? So again, that's where art, we could do a kind of social history through the history of art. We don't have to do it necessarily through economics or politics. You could trace the history of Geist, of humanity, and of freedom and its crisis in capitalism through art itself. And I'll just recall that suffering here, we looked at the theological political fragment by Benjamin. Suffering here is not merely unhappiness. It's not merely the suffering that transcends all history. Humans are mortal, we're fragile, we get sick, we die. There's that kind of suffering. There's suffering from unfulfilled potential, suffering from unfreedom. Right? So art as writing the history of that kind of suffering. Art as instantiating unfulfilled potential. Inscribing the history of that suffering, suffering from unfreedom. Rather than suppressing it in a form of positivity, which it didn't even have in the high bourgeois era, not even in classicism. By comparison, it looks like classicism is positive, but even then, that wouldn't exactly be right. It's only by comparison with what comes later that it appears to be positive. All right, I hope the end of the semester goes well for you guys and you have a good break. I'll look forward to your papers and I'll see some of you in my future classes.